The king stood at the top of his great castle, and as he looked down towards the rolling North Sea, there he could see his son and his daughter. Now his son had a sword in his hand, bright and sharp and shiny, and he raised it high above his head, and he was just about to chop off his sister's head. But that's not where the story starts. Oh, there was a king, a great king who lived in a castle in a place called Bamburgh. He had a wife and he had 2 children, and he would always look down towards the great dark North Sea, and he'd watch his children as they played by the side of the North Sea. And every morning they would go out and play with the crabs in the rock pools. They would look at the islands that were close to that place, the Farne Islands. If you look upon a map, you'll see that they're there. And every morning they would go out and they would count the Farne Islands, and every day they came up with a different number. They gave them names: Glororum, Shad, and there was one that they called the Nameless Rock, and they called it the Nameless Rock because they couldn't think of a name for it. And they lived well inside of that great castle in Bamburgh in the north of England. Now, his son was called the Child Wind. It was not that he was a child, he was neither a man nor a boy, and at that time anyone who ever wanted to become a knight with a sword in his hand and a shield in front of him, proudly dressed in all of his armour, when they were neither a man nor a boy, then they were known as a child. Now the king's daughter was beautiful to behold, and her name was the fair and lovely Margaret, and the 2 of them would play by the side of the North Sea. But one day the Queen died. The king's heart was broken. He didn't know what to say or what to do. And to make things even worse, his son, the Child Wind, decided that he would go and become a knight. And now he had lost his wife and his son, all in a short space of time. But his daughter, the fair and lovely Margaret, was tall and strong, beautiful and clever. And she walked up to her father and said, Father, please give me a silver key that will open a door inside of Bamburgh Castle." And the king knew exactly what his daughter was trying to do. She was trying to distract him, to make him feel better about all of the losses that had occurred in his life. And he gave her one of the silver keys that opened the door inside of the castle. And the fair and lovely Margaret, she made sure that there was a fire burning in the grate, that it was swept out, and all of those people who worked for the fair and lovely Margaret said they would never work for anyone else because she was so kind and so good as a mistress. And she asked her father for another key, and another, and another, and soon she had not 1, not 5, not 10, not 20, but 24 silver keys that she kept on a golden hoop at her shoulder. And now there were no more silver keys, for she was the mistress of this great castle and could gain entry through every door. And when she asked her father for another key, there was no other key than the great golden key that opened the gates at the front of Bamburgh Castle. But there were no more silver keys, and the king knew this. For all in this world, all he had was the great golden key that opened the front of the gates at Bamburgh Castle. And it was when he took this and he handed it over to his daughter, and when he looked into fair and lovely Margaret's eyes, all he could see were the eyes of his own dead wife. And if his heart had been broken before, then it was truly broken now. And he handed over the key for the gates to Bamburgh Castle, and he took to his bed, and he laid in that place for 7 days and 8 nights. Now this is a story from a long time ago, and at that time everyone would want to see their king, and when they couldn't see the king, they became nervous and frightened, for he would provide them with food in their bellies and a roof above their heads, and they could not see him, and they would go to his great chamber and they would knock upon the door, and still he would not rise. Now I have told you already that the fair and lovely Margaret was tall and strong, witty and clever, and she knew that her father liked nothing more and nothing less in all of this world than to go out hunting. She called all of the men who lived in that place together, She got them to be ready by the gates to Bamburgh Castle, all upon their horses, ready to go out hunting. And she went up the great stairs and went to her father's chamber and opened up the door, for she had the key. And she said, "Father, all of the men are ready to go out hunting, and you must ride at their front." The king knew that she was right, and so he rose from out of his bed, and down the great stairs he went, and outside. And as soon as he stood outside of the gates, everyone cheered. They were so pleased to see their king once more. And he started to ride. And as he rode through all of the trees and the forests to go out hunting. Now it so happened that there was a woman, a witchetty kind of a woman, who had wanted to be the Queen of Bamburgh Castle for nigh 200 years. And when she saw how heartbroken the king was, she knew that this was her chance. And so, in the way that all witches can, she changed her guise. She disguised herself and changed herself into a hare. A black hare that was as jet black as the night from the tip of its nose to the tip of its tail, long straight black ears that hung the full length of its body. And this woman, this witchetty woman in the guise of a jet black hare, ran in and out of all of the king's men as they were riding. Now the king looked down, and he'd never seen such a creature before in all of his life, and he started to follow after it. And he followed further and deeper and harder into the woods until he found himself far away from all of his men in the heart of the forest. And as he looked, there he saw that there was not a hare, but a woman. A woman with her back to him, with a long black hair that ran the full length of her body. And she was there with her hair caught in all of the brambles and the bushes in the thicket. Now the king wouldn't wait for a second. He jumped from his horse and started to pull her hair from out of the thorns, and sure enough, his fingers were pricked and the blood did drip down, and it mingled with her hair, and then she whispered weirding words, so that when she turned around, she looked like the most beautiful woman in all of this world. And he fell to his knees, and he begged and he pleaded with her to marry him. "Oh yes, I shall marry you," said this woman, "but only if you make me the Queen of Bamburgh Castle. It's yours. You shall become the Queen. But you must give me the 24 silver keys that are held upon a golden hoop, and you must give me the great golden key that opens the gates at the front of Bamburgh Castle. It's yours." And in all of that time, the king forgot about his own daughter, the fair and lovely Margaret. But the two of them were married in amongst all of the trees. And the two of them rode back from that place, side by side, and everyone lined themselves up by the side of the road to see this new queen as she came close. They cheered, they shouted, they wanted to see this queen with her jet black hair that ran the full length of her body. And they rode towards Bamburgh Castle, where everyone was waiting. Everyone stood waiting at the great entrance to Bamburgh Castle. They were all ready to come and see their new queen. Many had spoken as they had ridden across the land of how beautiful she was. The fair and lovely Margaret was there with the 24 silver keys on the golden hoop at her shoulder, and the great golden key inside of her pocket, ready to come and see her new mother. She stood there, she waited, and when they saw her, everyone was pleased to see that the king was happy with his new wife. The fair and lovely Margaret knelt down in front of this witchetty queen and reached for the 24 silver keys on the golden hoop and raised them towards her new mother. "These are for ye," but before the words had left her lips, this woman snatched them from out of her hand and said, "Now I am the Queen of Bamburgh Castle." Everyone in that place gasped. They could not believe that this new queen had snatched the keys away from the fair and lovely Margaret. Shaking and trembling, the fair and lovely Margaret reached for the great golden key, pulled it up towards this woman, and yet again she snatched it from out of her hands and said, "Now I shall be the Queen of Bamburgh Castle." Again, everyone gasped. Now there was a friend of the child Wines who was standing close by the fair and lovely Margaret, and we've all done this. He tried to whisper what he was thinking, but the whisper was loud enough for everyone to hear, and this is what he said: "We may have a new and a fair queen, but she could never be as beautiful as the fair and lovely Margaret." The witchetty queen heard all of this, but said nothing. But she waited for plan upon plan and scheme within scheme to take away the fair and lovely Margaret's beauty. And that night, everybody danced, everybody sang, everybody ate, everyone drank. And when her husband had gone to his bed, this terrible woman crept down the great stairs inside of the castle and went down into the cellars. And there she took the breath of 7 dead rats. She took the skin of 7 snakes. She took the belly and guts of 7 dead worms. And with slime from snails and slugs, she ground them all up and ground them down, and with witchetty words boiled them all down to just 7 drops, which she placed in a stoppered bottle about her neck, and back up the stairs she went to where the fair and lovely Margaret lay sleeping. And as this beautiful woman lay sleeping, she took 1 drop and she ran it from the top of her head to the tip of her chin. She ran a second drop down one arm and down the other arm, and 1 drop down one leg and another drop down the other, and stoppered the bottle about her neck and whispered witchetty words, for she knew what she was going to do. She was going to change the fair and lovely Margaret into a terrible, fearsome, loathsome Laidley worm. Not a worm that you would find underneath any stone, but a huge and terrible dragon of a worm that would slip and slither upon the slime on its belly and ravage this land and take fair Margaret away from her forever. She was well pleased with her work, for true enough, the fair and lovely Margaret's arms all folded under her skin, her 2 legs became as one, and her body was covered in slime, and she was changed into a loathsome Laidley worm that did slip and slither right out of the chamber and out of a window and down onto the ground and away from that castle. And wherever it travelled, the slime would turn the grass black. Wherever it travelled, it would curdle the milk before the cows had even given it. The next morning, her 2 maidservants came into the room and they screamed, "Ah! Oh, our mistress has been taken from out of this castle!" For they looked and they saw the slime trail, never thinking that the fair and lovely Margaret had gone out of the castle, but some great monster had come into that place and had eaten her. Everyone wept and wailed, screamed and cried. And who was it who wept and wailed the loudest? But the king's new wife. She lamented for the daughter that she could not find, but she knew full well just what she had done, and everyone travelled about that place to try and find this great and terrible monstrous worm. And always the new queen was at the front. And so it went on, that everyone was trying to find this great and terrible, loathsome Laidley worm, following its slime trails where the wheat was blackened, where the cows would give blood instead of milk. Now it so happened that with the wheat blackening and the oats not being ripened and no milk, that no one had anything to eat in that place. and everyone was travelling far and wide, and the wicked queen would smile to herself, knowing just exactly what it was that she had done. But it so happened that there were two men who were going down by a place called Spindleston Heath. And when they got to that place by the side of the sea, at the mouth of the cave, they heard roaring and snoring. And they believed that the great and terrible monstrous worm lived inside of that place. And so a great trough was cut, and into it was placed milk. Now, every night the milk was placed there, and every morning the milk was gone. But at least there were no rotted calves by the side of the road. At least it stayed in that place. But soon the milk was not sufficient for this great and loathsome Laidley worm, and it grew bigger and stronger. And yet again the blackened marks upon the earth were seen, and no one had anything to eat. Now, such a story would travel far and wide, and it travelled and was heard by the child Wind. The child Wind, who was now a man. Now he was truly a man, with a sword in his hand and a shield in front of him, proudly dressed in all of his armour. And when he had heard these tales, he knew that there must be weirding ways that had been used by some of the witchetty kind. And he knew that if he was to return to help his father so that they could grow crops, that he could find his own sister and rid the world of this Laidley worm, then he must not just travel in an ordinary boat. He took 33 of his best men and got them to chop down rowan trees that are strong against those of the witchetty kind, and they made a boat, and they travelled back across the sea towards Bamburgh. And when they were in the North Sea, this queen knew that they were close to that place. And what they did was this: she called for all of her witches, the witches who lived closer to that place, and she called for them all to fly once and twice and 3 times above the boat that brought the child Wind back to that place. And they did their mistress's bidding. They flew once and twice and 3 times above that boat to try and sink it. But it was made of the rowan tree that is strong against the witchetty kind. And they had to fly back to their mistress to tell her that they could not sink the boat. And now, the only friend that she had in all of this world was the great and the terrible, loathsome Laidley worm. And she ordered it to go out and swim once and twice and 3 times about the boat and cause a great whirlpool and sink that boat. And it did its mistress's bidding, and the Laidley worm swam out, and it swam around the boat that was made of the rowan tree so strong against the witchetty kind, and it caused a great whirlpool. Oh, and truly it tried to sink the boat, but the boat was made of the rowan tree, and it could not sink it. And now the great and terrible loathsome Laidley worm wrapped itself about a stone by the side of the North Sea, and a place that is there to this day called Adder Stone. For the Laidley worm was a great and terrible snaky monster, and it wrapped itself about the great Adder Stone. The child Wind's boat had been tossed from place to place upon the sea, but still he landed in Bede Bay. He was tired, he was wet, he was cold, but he knew just where he had to go. He went from Bede Bay all of the way to the Adder Stone, and here he saw that great and terrible, loathsome Laidley worm wrapped about the Adder Stone, and he raised his sword high in the air, and he was just about to chop off its head when it raised its head and spoke. Put down your sword and kisses give me 3, and I once more fair Margaret shall be. He listened. It sounded like his sister, but how could this terrible worm be his sister? And yet again he raised his sword high in the air, and again the loathsome, terrible Laidley worm spoke. Put down your sword and kisses give me 3, and I once more fair Margaret shall be. But how could this terrible worm be his sister? This time he raised the sword high above his head, and without raising its own head, the Laidley worm closed its eyes and lowered its head and spoke. Put down your sword and kisses give me 3, and I once more fair Margaret shall be. There was something about the voice that made the child Wind think that there was just a grain of possibility of it being his sister. He sheathed his sword. He reached towards its head, held it in his hands and kissed it once between its eyes, and once upon one cheek, and once upon the other, and there was a rushing sound and a rippling sound, and this great and terrible, loathsome Laidley worm reared up, and it split, and from out of the belly and guts of this great and terrible monstrous worm there stepped his sister, the fair and lovely Margaret. He took off his cloak, wrapped it about her shoulders. He said, "My sister, our father will be pleased that I have returned, happy to know that the Laidley worm is dead. But he will rejoice when he knows that I have brought you, my sister, the fair and lovely Margaret, back to Bamburgh Castle." The two of them walked side by side, he with his arm about her shoulder, she pulling his cloak close to her skin, and they walked all of the way back from Bede Bay to Bamburgh Castle. And so the two of them returned to the great and wonderful Bamburgh Castle. In their echoing halls, the two of them stood in front of the king and the queen. The king was excited to see his son return, but ecstatic to find out that the fair and lovely Margaret was returned to him. The child Wind stood there, a full-grown man, a sword in his hand, a shield in front of him, proud in all of his armour, and said, "Father, I have returned, and I have rid this country of the great and loathsome Laidley worm. And I have found my own sister inside of the belly and guts of that great creature. And I have returned. And now I will tell you that this woman," and here he pointed towards the witchetty queen, "this woman has used her weirding ways upon you, and she did place falsehoods upon your heart so that you would marry her, and she changed your own daughter into a Laidley worm, and now it is her turn." And here he reached for, not his sword, but a twig of the rowan tree. The rowan tree so strong against the witchetty kind, and he pointed it towards that woman. And he ran it from the top of her head to the tips of her toes, and ran it from one shoulder to the other. And there the woman changed before their very eyes. Her arms became shorter, her skin became green and slimy, and smaller she came till she was no bigger than the child Wind's fist. And she turned before their very eyes into a green and slimy, loathsome Laidley toad. He picked her up, showed it to the king. "This, father, is all that is left of that woman who has played her falsehood upon your heart. And now and he took that great loathsome Laidley toad and flung it to the base of the deepest well inside of Bamburgh Castle. And from that time there was happiness within Bamburgh Castle. But the king, it was often said that at the tick and tock of midnight, by the side of that place, by the deepest and darkest of wells, there could be heard the sound of a green and terrible, loathsome Laidley toad. St. Bede, or as many knew him as just Bede, when he was 7 years old, he entered a monastery in Monk Wearmouth. But for all of his adult life, he was known for working here in Jarrow. He was one of the most learned men in the whole of Europe. Through teaching and studying and learning, he became well known for all of the books that he wrote. And it was here, in this place, that he would work by candlelight, and he would make sure that the works and the words of our Lord were translated into Anglo-Saxon, for he knew that there were not many common men who understood Greek and Latin. And he would work. He would work inside of his darkened cells by candlelight. He would work hard and long hours, and soon his eyesight began to fade. His eyesight began to fade, and with time he became blind. But it didn't stop him, because what he would do was he would dictate to those younger monks who had good eyesight, and he would dictate to them great passages from the Bible so that they could write it down and illuminate it and place it inside of books for all and everyone to be able to read. It didn't stop him in his preaching either, for he had preached so long in this area that he knew every highway and byway, each lane and each nook and each cranny, and he could feel his way along the stones to find the way where people would want to listen to his preachings. But one day, he was outside of the monastery, just sitting and contemplating, when a mischievous boy came up to him. He said, "Father, there are a group of people who would wish to hear you preach." All the while, this mischievous boy was trying to stifle his laughter, because he knew that the Bede was completely and utterly blind and could not see. But they live some distance away. The Venerable Bede said, "Oh, you are a good boy. Please, would you lead me to that place?" Here the boy was holding on to his sides to think that he was leading this blind man, for he had no intention of taking him to where anyone could hear him. He was taking him out upon a road, and he was going to take him to a field and leave him and be lost. And all the while, Bede spoke to this boy and praised him for his help and his kindness, while the boy stifled his laughter. All the while, this wicked boy was laughing and smiling, for he'd taken Bede, Saint Bede, so far away that he would be lost. And he took him to where there were only trees and flowers and grass. The boy spoke. "Father, they are in silence because they wish to listen to you, to preach to them. Please begin your service as and when you wish." First Bede fell to his knees and he prayed, and then he started to preach to the trees, to the stones, to the twisted hawthorn bushes, the flowers and the grass. The boy thought this was the funniest thing that he had ever seen. This poor old blind man preaching to an empty field of trees. He was going to run away. As soon as he had finished, this boy was going to run away and leave him there in this field to find his own way home. The boy had not listened to a single word that Bede had spoken. He spoke of how Moses parted the Red Sea. He spoke of the miracle of the angel Gabriel as he spoke to Mary and Joseph, and the birth of Jesus in a manger in Bethlehem. But when he had finished, when Bede had finished, the boy heard, "Amen, amen, praise be to God." The boy thought that some men must have come to that place. And again he heard, "Amen, praise the Lord for all of the words that Bede has said." The boy looked. He could see no men standing there. And again they all cried out, "Amen, and praise the words of the Lord." And it was when he looked at the third time, he saw that it was the trees and the bushes and all of the grasses that were praising. It was the stones that had been so moved by the words of Saint Bede that they were venerating him, praising him for the words that he had spoken. The boy begged, prayed for forgiveness, because he had not even listened, and he was so moved by what Saint Bede had done that he told everyone about what Saint Bede had said and how he had been venerated and how he was venerable. And it is because of that, and from that time, that Bede, Saint Bede, was always known as the Venerable Bede. When the people of Morpeth found out that the great and powerful wizard Michael Scott was coming to their town, they were very excited indeed, for he was the greatest wizard of that time or any time. Anyone who knew the slightest part of a story or a tidbit of a tale were welcome to come and sit by a fireside and tell the tale, and many people dined out on even half a tale. But there was a man, and he knew this. He told the tale of when Michael Scott was walking along a deep dark path, and up jumped an imp, a terrible imp, and the imp spoke to him in this way: "Oh, you are Michael Scott, and I shall set you a challenge. You need to set me 3 tasks, and if I cannot complete all 3 of them, you will never see me again. But if I can complete them, then you will be my slave forever." Michael Scott was not one who would put a wager or a duel or a bet to one side. He looked towards this imp and spoke. "Well, my fine friend from the underworld, I will set you one task, and I do not think that you will be able to do it. It is to make a dam across the Tweed at Kelso." And it was almost as soon as these words had spilled from his lips that there it was, a dam across the Tweed at Kelso. Michael Scott thought of another task that he would set for this imp. He said, "My dear friend who dwells underneath the ground, I would wish for you to split the great mountain, the Cheviot, in 2. No sooner had he said it than on one side there was the Cheviot, and upon the other there was Hedgehope. But now he was worried, because in that place he only had to make one more task for this imp, and he spoke to him and said this: "You must take all of the sea sand that covers the whole of this place, and you must make it into a rope." But now the look in the imp's eye was terrible to behold, for this was a challenge that scared him. But sure enough, down the imp went to the side of the sea and grabbed a handful of salty sea sand and another and placed them together and tried to make them into a rope. And to this day, that imp is still there trying to make a rope out of salty sea sand. There was a woman. She knew another story. And this was the story of why the great and powerful Michael Scott was coming to Morpeth in the first place. For there was the King of Scotland, and he had entreated the King of all Paris to stop sending his pirates to sink all of the Scottish ships. He had sent ambassadors and envoys and gifts and all kinds of different ways of entreating the French king to stop sinking the Scottish boats with his pirates. But the French king would have none of it. He would take the gifts. He would take and strip the clothes from the ambassadors and the envoys. But he did not stop the pirates. And so the King of France was going to be sent Michael Scott. Michael Scott had been asked by the King of Scotland to go, but Michael Scott did not take presents and gifts or try to be any kind of an ambassador. All he did was, with all of his charms, he conjured up a huge black horse, a huge horse. When he arrived in France, the King of Paris stood there and looked. "So what is it that you have brought for me?" Michael Scott looked. "I have brought for you a horse that will teach you a lesson." "Well, I do not like it," said the King of all Paris. "I do not like the horse." "Well, please your majesty, please let my black horse stamp its feet once and twice and 3 times. "You can do whatever you want," said the King of Paris. Michael Scott looked hard and deep into the dark eyes of this black horse. It raised its hooves, and once and twice and 3 times it brought them down upon the ground, and every bell in every belfry inside of all of Paris shook and tolled. The King of France was not particularly bothered by this. Michael Scott looked at him again. "Your Majesty, would you like me to let my horse stamp its hooves another 3 times?" "I do not care," said the King of all Paris. But this time, this horse raised its hooves once and twice and 3 times, and 2 of the great towers at the front of that palace in Paris were shaken off. The King of France fell to his knees. "Just tell me what it is that you want." Oh, soon enough he knew that he had to stop the pirates from sinking those Scottish ships. And now Michael Scott was returning to his home, and he was going to be stopping in Morpeth. And when the people of Morpeth had found out that Michael Scott, the great wizard, was going to be staying inside of their town, they were very excited. When they'd heard all of the tales of what Michael Scott could do, they thought of what he could do for them. A man spoke up. "The great city of Newcastle has a great river, the Tyne, that runs through the middle of it, and all of the schooners and ships can come right to the very middle of the town. And if we had a river like that, then we would become a much more prosperous town, just like Newcastle upon Tyne. I think that when we have Michael Scott stay inside of our town, we should ask him to bring the sea to Morpeth. Then we could have a tide at Morpeth. We could have all of the moorings that we could ever want in this world instead of a small river, the Wansbeck. I think that we should ask him to bring the sea to Morpeth." Michael Scott, when he heard this entreaty, he thought about it. "It is indeed something that I can do. But if I do it for you, you must understand that the runic magic that I will use will only work once. And tomorrow morning, you must bring to me the fastest runner in all of this town. And you must meet me by the mouth of the Wansbeck by the North Sea." There was one boy. Thomas Cresswell was his name. He was the fastest runner in all of that place. No one could keep up with him. They did not know what the task would be that Michael Scott would set him, but he was ready for it. He had run on the fells. He was a shepherd, strong in his arm and in his mind and in his legs. And so they went to the shore where the North Sea meets the Wansbeck. So down to the sea they went, Thomas Cresswell and all of the men of Morpeth, and there was Michael Scott, and he laid a hex upon Thomas Cresswell's shoulders and told him this, that it would work only once, that he would need, once the tide had reached its height, he would need to run by the side of the Wansbeck's shores, and he would need to run all of the way to Morpeth, but he must never turn around, for the water would recede to the shore. As soon as the tide had reached its height, Thomas Cresswell started to trot, but he could hear a noise behind him. It was the sound of the sea elves and the water imps, as they were screaming and yelling, for they did not want to have to do extra work to bring the sea all of the way to Morpeth. So he ran faster, as fast as his legs would take him. For Thomas Cresswell, strong in his head and his heart and his legs, he still ran. His heart beat in his chest like a drum. He ran so hard and so fast, and he did not want to turn around, but the screaming became so terrible that it was only as he came close to Morpeth, so close that he could almost smell the town, that he started to feel frightened, so frightened that he could barely breathe, and still he ran. And on he ran, always with the sounds of the water imps and the elves behind him. He was frightened, the water was cascading at his back. He knew that he was not supposed to turn around, and still he heard them screaming, laughing at him. And it was when he came to Bothell that in that place he could not stop himself, and for a brief moment he turned around and looked. And it was then that all he could hear in that place was the laughing of the water sprites and the imps, for they knew that they had tricked him. And the sea would never travel that way. All of the way where the Wansbeck had once been, the sea would never come to that place, and the tide would never be heard in Morpeth. Now, the young Lord Lambton was a ne'er-do-well wastrel, and everyone knew this. When he was told to do one thing, then he would do another. When he was asked to speak to all of the people who would soon be his tenants, he spoke like a slipshod shepherd. And one Sunday, when he was supposed to go to church with everyone else, so that he could be seen with the true Lord of Lambton, his father, he decided that he would go fishing. He dressed himself in his worst clothes. He sat himself upon a rock in the middle of the weir, and he decided that he would go fishing, and he threw out silky worms that fell upon the water. And in the weir, he had always been able to catch fish, and inside of his mind, he thought that he would catch a beautiful salmon. But as he threw out his own line and tried to reel it back in, he would find nothing. So he started to curse the clouds, the rain, the weather, this place of Lambton itself, and even the fact that he lived in this place. And just as he cast his line for the last time and he started to draw it in, he could feel something at the other end of the line, and he pulled, and still he thought about a salmon, a fine fat salmon upon his table that would taste fine upon his lips, and he pulled and he dragged at it. And I've got to tell you that the rod bowed, and he pulled, and there he found at the other end of the line a worm. Black, oily, greasy, with 9 holes by the side of its mouth, and it pulled and it tugged on the line. And when he dragged it in, instead of trying to take the hook away gently and carefully, he just ripped it from out of its mouth and threw it into a well that was hard by the side of the river weir. A stranger who was walking along that way passed and looked into the well and saw this most frightful worm. The Scottish people would call them a worm, for it wasn't something that crept and crawled and slipped and slithered underneath a rock. It was a great and a terrible, monstrous worm, and he looked at it, and it was as if the devil himself had cast this thing into the well. Lord Lambton was not pleased. Lambton had not made many friends in all of that time, and if he could curse the clouds and the rain and the river weir itself, then he would not stay. He decided that he would travel far away from that place and seek his fortune as a knight and fight for those people who would pay him the most, or whichever side was winning. He forgot about the worm in the well, and he travelled far away from that place, but the worm grew, The worm would empty the well. It grew bigger and stronger, and soon it crept and crawled and slipped and slithered its way from out of the well. And it would go about the countryside, and people would find the bodies of lambs and cows and sheep upon the ground. And old Lord Lambton did not know what he could possibly do. He didn't know what he could do about that worm. So the old Lord Lambton called for all of his wise men and asked them what he should do if he was to try and placate this terrible worm. The wisest of all of his wise men said that what he should do is this, for there was a trough at the front of the Lambton Palace, and it was a trough that the horses would feed from, and he decided that what he should do is take all of the water out of that place and fill it with milk. Now, it took the milk of 7 oxen to feed it, but Lord Lambton did not mind, for if it kept all of the cows and sheep and lambs safe, then he would pay that money for all of that ox's milk. But still it got bigger and stronger, and after the distance of 7 years, the young Lord Lambton returned. But he had changed. He had learnt the ways of the world. He was no longer a wastrel or a ne'er-do-well, for he had learned many hard lessons when he had fought in battles. And when he came back, he realised that it was his fault that this worm was terrorising the whole of the countryside. And he stood in front of his father and said, "My father, it is my duty to get rid of this worm." Now, the old Lord Lambton was frightened, for many knights and soldiers had come to that place to try and rid the place of this great and terrible Lambton worm. Many had gone, and tales were told of when it was cut, then it would form itself back together again. Tales were told that it was so big that it would wrap itself 3 times around a hill that was hard by Lambton. The old Lord Lambton did not want his son to die. He begged him, he beseeched him not to do it. But the young Lord Lambton, stronger, more careworn, but stronger inside of his heart and his mind, was determined that he would kill the Lambton worm. It was decided between the old Lord Lambton and the new Lord Lambton that he should go and visit a witch who lived in a cave that also was close by Lambton, for she was the wisest of all, wiser than any of Lambton's wise men. And young Lord Lambton, he went and he visited that old woman, and she smiled. "Oh, it is good that you have come to see me, for you know that I am the wisest in all of this place, and it is good that you have asked me, for I know exactly what it is that you should do. When you come to fight that great and terrible worm, do not fight it upon the land. I know that you went fishing upon a rock in the middle of the weir. You must go and stand upon the rock, and you must be in that place, and you must fight. And there you shall win, but only if you take your armour to a blacksmith and get him to put the sharpest of all of spears upon your armour, and then you shall win." These seemed strange things for the young Lord Lambton to do, but he did do them. But before he went, he visited the woman once again. He said, "Old woman, you have not asked me for any kind of a reward for your advice. Or the only reward I need is this, that when you return, and when you have slain that great and terrible worm, then you must slaughter whatever it is, the first thing that lives that you see. And if you do not, then a curse shall lie upon the Lambton family, that for 9 generations, none of the men in that family, shall die in their beds in their sleep." So the day dawned And the young Lord Lambton was ready, there with his armour and the spearheads upon it, and he went to that rock, and sure enough, it was as soon as he got to that place, that when he raised his sword and he chopped at the tail of the Lambton worm, that the tail went into the river and was swept away, and it could not reform itself. But now, I've got to tell you this, that great worm was angry, so angry that it screamed and roared and wrapped itself about him. But the tighter that it wrapped itself about him, the more the spears came into its flesh, and it tore itself into 1,000 pieces and was washed away from that place. Now young Lord Lambton had said that with his father he would blow a bugle and he must let fly one of his hounds, and young Lord Lambton was ready to sacrifice, for that would be the first thing that he would see that was living, that would come towards him. But when the bugle was blown, the old Lord Lambton was so excited that he ran down to that place, and he ran to meet his son. Young Lord Lambton could not bring himself to slay his own father, so he told his father to let fly with one of his hounds, and he thought that that would be sufficient. But it wasn't. And that old witch's curse lay upon the Lambton family, and for 9 generations not one of the male members of that family ever died in their bed.